Good evening and welcome to Virtual Wednesdays. My name is Devin Malone and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. I'm excited to welcome you to today's conversation, Criticality and Connection in the Work of Faith Ringgold. Over the course of today's program, you'll hear presentations by scholars Dr. Michele Wallace, Dr. Joan Kee, and Dr. Jacqueline Francis. These presentations will be followed by a conversation moderated by Dr. Susan Cahan. To share more about today's speakers, Dr. Michele Wallace, a professor emeritus of English, Women's Studies, and Film Studies at the City College of New York and the City University of New York Graduate Center, is founder and director of the Faith Ringgold Society, which has a mission to publish writings about artist Faith Ringgold. The daughter of Ringgold, she has also written extensively on her mother's work, including American People, Black Light, Faith Ringgold's paintings of the 1960s. She's currently working on an upcoming book, The Mona Lisa Interview, Faith Ringgold's French and American Collections, 1990 to 1999. Dr. Joan Kee is a professor in the history of art at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and a Ford Foundation Scholar in Residence at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. A contributing editor to Artforum, her books include Contemporary Korean Art, Ten C'est Quoi and the Urgency of Method, and most recently, The Geometries of Afro-Asia, Art Beyond Solidarity. Dr. Jacqueline Francis is a professor and chair of the graduate program in Visual and Critical Studies at California College of the Arts. She writes social histories of modern and contemporary art and visual culture of the United States, and is especially interested in the representation of ethno-cultural and racial identities and identifications. Dr. Susan Cahan is an art historian, curator, and educator who specializes in contemporary art and the history of museums. Her research focuses on the relationship between social and artistic change and the confluence of factors that shape the way culture is imagined, discussed, and advanced. She is the recipient of an Arts Writers Grant from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, among other awards. To start us off for the evening, Dr. Michele Wallace will present on her mother's work. Thank you so much for joining us.
My mother, the artist Faith Ringgold, was born in 1930. I, her firstborn daughter, Michele Wallace, was born in 1952, which makes me roughly 20 years younger than her. From 1986 through 1991, Faith did a series of story quilts unlike any she had ever done before or would do since, composed of photo etchings of Black and white images of herself and other family taken from the photographs her mother had collected. The name of the series was Change, the 100-pound weight loss story quilt and performance. The goal was serious, which was to lose what she considered the 100 pounds excess weight she was carrying at that point, but also to explore how the weight gain had come about. So she selected a photographic image of her body for every year since she had been born, up until the 1980s, when the first of these quilts were completed. She wrote a large self-deprecating text to illustrate each decade, and later she added songs, which she performed to the accompaniment of a drumming group called the Women of the Calabash. When I was reunited with my mother in Englewood in 2007 and decided to study the progress of her work in earnest, the Change story quilt was one of the first mysteries I wanted to unravel. First, because it was composed of family photographs that had by that time become unfamiliar to me. My grandmother died in 1981, which was when I last had access to her photographic collection. Also, I had my own writing career. I was married, teaching, and preoccupied with many other things. I had seen the work. I was even present at the performance of the work at the Bernice Steinbaum Gallery in 1988. But simple observation has never been enough to understand what Faith Ringgold was up to. This was also true in this case. I'm going to begin this presentation with a short clip from her rehearsal tape the rehearsal tape Faith made at the time of the performance in her apartment in Harlem with the drummer Joan Ashley. The clip I am showing will connect to the 51-minute rehearsal tape I've posted on my YouTube page.
Anyway, what I wanted to do in order to keep the weight off, because you can lose it, but you may not keep it off, was to document the change with the art. Use a positive compulsion to control a negative one and make it very public, like this performance, you see. And do it often, like every year, create another quilt with more stories and show more photographs, because I have all my photographs from 1930 when I was born. I have the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s in my photographs, so that I can find out exactly when and how I started to gain the weight. Because when you have been around as long as I have, you could forget, you know, what you were doing over all those decades. So when you're looking at the photographs, you know, it brings it all crashing back to you and helps you not to repeat the history of it all. I have 40 more to lose, maybe 30, maybe 20, I'm not sure, because I'm not sure exactly what my body's going to look like when I have lost, say, from 20 to 40 more pounds. And, okay, the 100 pounds are represented here in these two bags of weights, which is water, because water is very heavy, you know. So they're just 2-liter plastic bottles filled with water, and there's 11 in each one of these bags, and they constitute about 100 pounds, which I can't pull alone, but I could pull each one in 50 weights. So in order to keep myself honest and remind myself of where I came from, I will pull these weights. And please, I'd like to invite some of you to come up here also and try and see if you can pull these, you know, 100-pound weights, because this is it's not easy to do it. I have been through years, 20 years or more of promising to lose weight for different occasions. I was going to lose it for New Year's Eve. I was going to lose it for Christmas. I was going to lose it for any number of exhibitions that I had. And I finally did it. So here we are to celebrate that. The fact that all that's got to change.
In 2013, I was invited to present at a portraiture conference given by Deborah Willis in Paris, for which I made this PowerPoint, understanding that the viewers would only have a brief glance of what I was presenting. In addition to family photographs and cartoon images Mom has done of family members, including myself, there are self-portraits she has either drawn or painted. Mom has written 2 books about myself and my sister. The first of these was called Letter to My Daughter. Michele Wallace, author of Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, for which she couldn't really find a publisher, so she finally self-published it. And the second book, which focuses on both daughters and granddaughters, was not a written text like the first book, but rather a series of illustrated drawings, such as this first one, in which I am presented reading from Black Macho, my first book. The words she puts into my mouth have more to do with how Faith saw the book and its message, that it was a critique of the way I was raised. It's possible that Black Macho was actually a critique of the way all of us were raised. There are a series of photos, all included in Change. Faith and her 2 siblings, Barbara and Andrew, as children, dressed in clothes made by my grandmother, who was a stay-at-home mom. The second set of images refers to images of Faith as a young woman, during a period in which she got married to my father, Earl, and had 2 children, my sister and I. The first image here is one of the pastel self-portraits she was constantly doing when I was a child as an exercise. She was a student at City College when I was born. Perhaps the most magnificent set of photos we have for this period are of my Aunt Barbara's wedding, who was given the big wedding, which launched my grandmother's fashion career. In the same year, Earl eloped with my mom and married. She said her prime motivation was to get out of my grandmother's house. Jojo and Aunt Barbara, who had had a lavish wedding, nevertheless didn't have a job, and so had moved into my grandmother's small apartment. My mom found this unbearable, so she decided to marry Earl, who's right in the middle of this picture, who was a close family friend and lived in the next building, and whose mother was away with her second husband on military terry duty in Guam. Next section, fashion shows. These were a big part of our lives. Faith and Aunt Barbara were often my grandmother's star models. What I notice about this period is I believe my mother's weight is going up and down. She wasn't, but she was in that period of her life when you're young and perhaps you could just not eat for a week and lose pounds to fit into an outfit. That's my grandmother's business card. These pictures make me happy. This is mother with Barbara and I. Okay, graduations is the next section. These photos portray life for Faith from 1959 to the early 60s. Malcolm Barron, who was a very proficient photographer and who went on to fame with the pop artists, taught Faith how to photograph her own work once he was no longer able to do it. I believe these pictures in our living room in the Bronx were shot as he was also taking photographs of her art. Oh, I love this picture. And this is our living room in the Bronx, my gorgeous mother. This is her getting married to my stepdad. Okay. Self-portraits, more self-portraits. More self-portraits in mass and in various forms. This is a self-portrait. Another self-portrait. And collaborations with my grandmother. This is Faith's first quilt, a second quilt, which was cut in pieces by my grandmother, and mother made it. It's called the Mother's Quilt after she died. Then we get into the panels in which the photographs are being used. The photo montages Faith constructed to describe each decade of her life. This first set is, of course, when she was a child. And I present them in different ways. It was really hard to get photos of these things too, because on account of the fact that there's so many photographs in them, that means that they are large files. Independently, they would be large files. Together, they're huge files. But these were the etchings that the prints were made from. Because, you know, we didn't have the technology that we have now when she did this. And actually, I don't even really know how they did it, what they did at the Bob Blackburn studio. This slide, I could read a little bit of this. In 1961, you discovered French bread and cheese and wine with your meals in Europe, though you were brought up to believe that people who drank wine were winos. The French, however, carried their wine well, that is, everywhere. They drank it like water. In Italy, you acquired a refined taste for pasta, veal parmesan, olive oil, and more wine. Cafe dining on the Via Veneto in Rome stimulated your palate and enlarged your waistline. Eating was fun, but it was also therapeutic. This is the 70s. I like this one too, this text. In the 1970s, food was a feminist issue, and you were a fat feminist, always looking for a quasi-politically correct reason to eat. And of course, you found plenty of them. In the 60s, it was being a wife and mother, the rejection of being a Black artist and other oppressions. In the 70s, it was all that and being a woman too. You didn't have to eat over that. You didn't solve anything by having 2 dinners at one meal, and don't blame anybody. You used to say to your husband, Burdett, you used to say your husband, Burdett, made you eat so that no one else would look at you. And then you didn't look at you either. You used to say you never served leftovers because your family hated them. Your family never saw anything they left over. You'd eat it all up while you were washing the dishes. You were so embarrassed that day when you entered a Midtown restaurant eating cookies. I'll be back, the waiter said, when you finished eating. I think that's one of the funniest ones. I don't, you know, my mother has this sense of humor that is just, so all these stories, which are about a great deal of pain, are also very humorous. And that's with Dad and my baby Faith. This is an image from the performance and the women of the Calabash, and Lisa Yee, Mom's former assistant, who we'd love to find. Every story is a tongue-in-cheek story about losing or gaining weight. There are many self-portraits and portraits sprinkled throughout Faith's work. For instance, Tar Beach takes off from an experience she had on Tar Beach when she lived in Harlem. Among the French collection is Matisse's chapel in Vence. Faith once again uses family photographs to construct the gathering of all her ancestors to talk about slavery. There are included here as well a series of drawings Mom did of us. When she had a fax machine, a message in response to some request was as likely to come in the form of a drawing and in the form of words. For instance, in this message, which I kept, I had to make a copy of it because it was on the old fax paper. Dear Michelle, 6 women. What can you expect? We're only women. All is forgotten, but let's remember not to talk. Exclamation mark, love, Faith. The large woman in the middle is her. On the left and the right is Barbara and I. And on the side there are Barbara's 3 children. Now, you gotta remember this is in 1995. So I am, let's see, I was born in 52, so I'm 40 something, as is my sister. But we are the size of, I just love this, the way she makes this triangular structure with her at the apex. I mean, it's just so her. And then she also uses this image, a similar image again, in the book that she did about us, Faith, Michelle, and Barbara and the 3 grands. What can you expect? We're only women. And then this was the last self-portrait I could find, which was commissioned by the New Yorker a number of years ago. Before all of this is before all the hoopla started about American people and Black light. And I just thought I would like to go back to some of this work since, well, actually, I think either 1 or 2 of the changes is in the exhibition. But I know that people look at things and they breeze past and they don't necessarily know what they're looking at, so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace, and good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Cahan. I'm the Dean of the Tyler School of Art and Architecture in Philadelphia, and I'm speaking to you from the East Coast. I have the pleasure of moderating tonight's panel, and up next, I'd like to offer the floor to Jackie Francis.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody at the Young for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion following the last of the papers. This paper started back in March of this year of 2022, when I saw this mixed media work in the New Museum's retrospective exhibition. Right there in the galleries in Manhattan, I texted a photo of The Flag is Bleeding, #2, to my friend John, with whom I'm working on a survey of this African-American artist's work. Sergeant Claude Johnson, who lived from 1888 to 1967, established his reputation in the 1920s and 1930s. His influences were many: pre-Columbian art, West African ritual sculpture, Cubism, Indigenous American textiles. He made abstract and realistic drawings, enamel paintings, decorative and functional objects, and most famously, sculpture. Among the best known of the sculpture is this one in the collection of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art here in California, acquired by SF MoMA during Johnson's lifetime. John, I said to my friend via text, we have got to make note of this work by Faith Ringgold for our exhibition publication on Johnson's legacy and influence. Like me, John hadn't seen the Faith Ringgold painted quilt before. And the wall label of The Flag is Bleeding, #2 at the New Museum made no mention of Ringgold's unmistakable engagement with Sergeant Claude Johnson's sculpture, a canonical object of the long Black Renaissance of the 20th century. Johnson's Forever Free, controversial at the time of its debut, is a puzzling representation of the 1930s. The woman is not dressed in period clothing. Her garb seems to belong to the 19th century. In the 1930s, some observers criticized Johnson's work as anachronistic. To them, this figure was not a new Negro, not an exemplar of Black modernity. The work proffered, they argued, a mammy figure that ought to be retired. As my colleague John will be writing about in his essay about Sergeant Claude Johnson's maternal figures, such as Forever Free, this work poses a question that we likely won't be able to answer. Was Sergeant Claude Johnson celebrating Black motherhood, here offered as a noble figure of propriety and dignity, and one who was perhaps under duress? Or was Sergeant Claude Johnson sending up the trope of the Black mammy, the popular American cultural representation of Black women in films, photography, advertising, and everyday goods? Ringgold's quilted painting similarly raises questions about the maternal figure with bloodshot eyes. However upright, this character is not sleeping enough, or maybe crying too much, or maybe both. I know that we see this kind of expressionist treatment in other Ringgold works, such as the Two Jemimas, an acrylic on canvas and fabric work of 1997. Then in The Flag is Bleeding #2, there are these two strange children, a boy and a girl, and their spindly legs. Are they malnourished because the mother figure has given all her milk to other people's children, and metaphorically to the American nation as a whole? The woman's breasts bleed, letting the liquid flow much more easily than blood from any stone. And at the New Museum, I also saw that Ringgold in The Flag is Bleeding #2 hadn't done only one shout out to Sergeant Claude Johnson. Here, she represents him toward the left edge of this acrylic on canvas work, just to the left of the guy in the hat. The guy in the hat is the historical African-American painter, William Henry Johnson, no relation to Sergeant Johnson, who I show here in a photograph. So Les Cafés des Artistes is a cast of the School of Paris modernism, as well as those not always numbered in that group, and who Ringgold means to give bigger roles than they ever had before. Our cast here in Les Cafés des Artistes. At the rear is Ed Clark, Raymond Saunders, Jacob Lawrence, Toulouse-Lautrec, Maurice Trillo. In the middle, Sergeant Claude Johnson, Romare Bearden, Aaron Douglas, Henry Ossawa Tanner, Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and Augustus Savage. In the front, William Henry Johnson, Archibald Motley, Ringgold's invented character of Willa Marie Simone, Elizabeth Catlett, Lois Mailou Jones, Nita Vo Warwick Fuller, Edmonia Lewis, and Ringgold herself. As curator Dan Cameron and others have noted, the French collection is an insistent historical turn by Ringgold. The project recasts and revises Eurocentric narratives of artistic production with images and with real actors who, in Ringgold's view, were there for moments of critical artistic production. These protagonists are those who could have been there and should have been there, according to Ringgold. Text, narrative or epistolary, scripted into the quilt's borders, accompany these provocative images. To focus on the words of Les Cafés des Artistes, I'm going to present a few of the parts of Willa Marie Simone's manifesto. What I'm hearing in these words, the utterances of this fictional character, a predecessor or an ancestor of the artist who Ringgold will become, is that Willa-Marie Simone views modernist art as a collaborative project. Echoing the timeless question, what is the role of the artist in society? Ringgold wonders, how would her Black female body / any Black female body be seen? And what would it do in the modernist project? So the Black woman, the woman of color, may lay claim to agency and may make interventions, but it's not a sure thing. She can be part of the crowd, the crew. The standing figure of Willa-Marie Simone is among the guys in Le Café des Artistes who have their own alliances. Notice the proximity of Gauguin and Van Gogh. And they also show off their alienation. Notice at the back, Ed Clark sitting on his own and Toulouse-Lautrec rather standoffish. The men are around Willa-Marie Simone. Check out how the Archibald Motley figure wolfishly regards her. Yet somehow, she says, the cafe space is home. The French Connection takes up a tactic evident in preceding painting produced in Europe. Fantin Latour's Hommage de Delacroix pays homage to a great man. In quotes, I use that phrase, of his time. Eugène Delacroix, who had died in 1863 and is posthumously depicted in the gilded portrait in the background of this painting, Hommage de Delacroix. Fantin Latour means to demonstrate that in 1864, Delacroix, though gone, had not been forgotten by his admirers who rolled deep, including Charles Baudelaire, James Whistler, and Edouard Manet. In By the Table, also known as At the Table, the painting does what its title advertises, proclaim who's at the table of radical poets. Among them are seated Arthur Rimbaud. Missing corporeally was Charles Baudelaire, who had died the year before. Purportedly, he's there as the spray of flowers at the right. Remember that Ringgold had centered Africa in Willa-Marie Simone's manifesto in Café des Artistes. In the slave rape series, she self-represents herself and her daughters, Barbara and Michelle. Here, I'm also thinking about Ringgold's historical borrowings. Ringgold came to produce Africa here via the Tibetan Thangka tradition of painting that she saw in the Rijksmuseum in 1972, when one of the museum's guards urged Ringgold to see that museum's collection of Thangkas. For Ringgold, as a Black American woman, and as such always negotiating respectability politics, there were, of course, great risk in inserting herself as a nude, albeit one who is not reclining, and one who is sure as hell ready to give as much, if not more, than she can take. Building from the scholar Saidiya Hartman's notion of critical fabulation, I propose that the slave rape series is a critical fabulation in the visual realm. In Hartman's influential 2008 essay, Venus in Two Acts, she writes about her critical fabulation method as a way to, quote, present a full picture of the lives of African captives, end quote. The fabula, which Hartman notes is art historian Mike Ball's construction, is likely to remain partial and incomplete. Fabula denotes the basic elements of the story, the building blocks of narrative that produce something new. Hartman and Ball and Lisa Lowe, whose notion of unavailable objects, methods, and matters Hartman also cites, concede that the critical fabulation is made with and against something. It seems that Hartman's reference to the object that insists and resists in its insistence is especially applicable to the slave rape paintings. And of course, Hartman also borrows the notion of resisting objects from the scholar Fred Moten. Scholars looking at this Ringgold painting of the 60s seem to struggle with the recovery of narrative in this fracas. Who started it? Who's helping whom? Does it matter when Ringgold does her part, namely to illuminate the contested character of history, narrative, event, and fact, to topple the hierarchy of discourse? And these, in this passage, I've used Hartman's words about her purpose of critical fabulation and applied them to Ringgold's Die. Mining Hartman's essay, Venus in Two Acts again, I seize Hartman's words to frame my reading of this painting, which many see as Faith Ringgold's most principal influence in terms of the work Die. Hartman has written, quote, "They are the stories that one tells in dark times, a narrative of defeat that can enable a place for the living or enable an alternative future," end of quote. I think of Jacob Lawrence's panel number 52 from his 60 panel series, The Migration of the Negro, done in 1940, 1941, which I think Ringgold might have seen at the Museum of Modern Art and perhaps in reproduction many, many times. The compositional intervals and the decisive gestures, the uncertain ground and the frozen moment in Lawrence's panel seem so connected to Ringgold's Die. Of course, modernist painters, Ringgold, Picasso, Lawrence, have different tactics from those available to postmodernist writers such as Saidiya Hartman, Lisa Lowe, and Fred Moten. While it is impossible to tell the whole story in any expressive form, painters always seem to make pictures in ways that writers simply cannot. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That was wonderful. We have one more presentation by Joan Kee, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. Thanks, Joan.
Right, so what I'm going to do rather than a scripted presentation is talk more through some works and how they raise a series of questions and provocations, focusing especially on her tanka. So one of the propositions I'd like to raise is to think about Faith Ringgold's work as an Afro-Asian cultural engagement, an exemplary point from which to rethink ideas of globalization through concepts such as the third world, or in my mind, more interestingly, the idea of a global majority. And here we have some of the first completely abstract works that Ringgold did. And I'm bringing this up here because one, you notice it's in a collective formation. And two, you might also notice the geometric patterns in the middle. So the central panel of geometrically arranged shapes. So this refers to Kuba textiles. So Kuba textiles being made in a certain part of Central Africa. Sometimes these sorts of geometric patterns have been belatedly referred to as abstraction beyond and before what took place in Western Europe and the United States. But more important is to remember that this kind of textile production, and especially the embroidery, was the realm of women. So in, say, when we think about Kuba textiles, we want to also think about the production itself as being gendered. That was also done in public. It was not considered a private activity, and it was also done in groups. So what would happen is that one woman would start on one section of the textile, and then just move, hand it off to somebody else, almost like a sort of like a relay race being run. Another aspect to think about was these Kuba textiles, which also resonates with Ringgold's work, is how geometric forms are not so much, they're read more as shapes or blocks that occupy space. So in other words, these are not considered linear patterns. In fact, line it's an edge. It's not considered a division. So one builds up pictorial space as one moves sort of from one direction to the other. And so this logic is also something that governs, say, the way in which Ringgold has also configured these geometric shapes, and it's one geometric form after the other. Now let's see. Now here was the format of the tanka. So this is something that Professor Francis just alluded to. And on the right is, in fact, one of the tankas that was then on display at the Rijksmuseum. So the Rijksmuseum had received a loan of tankas at the time, and Ringgold was then traveling in Europe. Now, at the time Ringgold saw these tankas, it was not long after she had embarked on her series of works given the title Political Landscapes, that were also inflected in part by a heightened awareness of China after then President Richard Nixon traveled to Beijing. Now, the common explanation for why the artist turns towards the tanka is the practical considerations. So the Rikers mural that was just shown previously, again, it was very big, it was very difficult to transport, that mobility issues led Ringgold to adapt this kind of format, which is, again, tankas essentially refer to a kind of religious painting, usually associated with Tibetan Buddhism, that you can roll up. They're soft, they're made of fabric, and they're also meant to be devotional objects. And usually in Buddhism, they're used as support for religious meditation, for various rituals and practices, and also for protection for places and persons, as well as used for religious teachings. So this kind of multifunctionality is something to also take into account when viewing these tankas, that it's not only the practical benefits of being able to roll and transport these paintings easily, but also the sedimentation of meaning that the tanka format has carries with it. Now, here's also where we might want to think about how tankas are originally displayed. So for example, here on the left, what we see are, people gathering around tankas. So a tanka would be, say, transported from one place to the other, and it's usually seen collectively, as you see here. It's not a one-to-one experience. I think this is also something important to recognize with Ringgold's work, is that to what extent do her works allow for the generation of different groups or assemblies? The other aspect to think about is that tankas were often seen with sound, chanting, humming, droning. And you notice here in the upper right-hand corner that tankas are seen not, again, as standalone autonomous objects, but as in groups. And here you see that they're suspended from the sort of the roof right here. They're usually in multiples and very, very well above above the head of the viewer in some cases. Although here people are sitting down. Here, for example, your neck is craning to see the works. So one of the questions that then Ringgold's works has us think about is, what would the tankas look like if displayed like their Tibetan analogs, given how the artists also saw them as a kind of hanging prayer rug to mediate with each morning and evening. So the Windows of the World, this is a work that Ringgold made to, again, think about wanting to give her daughters and their husbands magical protection. So in other words, it's a work that has us think about what is unseen as well as what is visible. Let's see. Now here is, again, the way here we have the windows on Windows on the World. And this is an installation view at the new museum, the most recent iteration of Ringgold's retrospective, titled The Wake and Resurrection of the Bicentennial Negro, 1975 to 1989. And you notice that there are other objects here that are placed in front of the works. So the artwork is actually pegged to the US bicentennial celebration of 1976, and it marks her first multimedia performance piece. The poetic installation tells the fictional story of Buba and Bina, who experienced a rebirth and reawakening. So this is where we want to also think about how is it that Ringgold's work, rather than being objects in a secular world, or rather, can we see them instead as boundaries between a secular world and a world yet to come, or the world that has been? So this is also another question that these works raise. Now, here's another installation view. Now, the work itself was began in the mid-1970s. So this coincides at the time when the expansion of the art market tended to, again, pressure artworks into performing as commodities to be traded now or the short term, or especially in the US context, artworks made to be seen as symptoms of a certain kind of conscripted modernism. Now, this is also where I think Ringgold is pushing back. It's, again, it's wanting to propose a larger view of art that could not be untied from the afterlife, that, again, artworks as being something more than what secular demands wanted it to be. Here was, again, the couple that's, the pair that's upright, the mourners that are upright, and then here's, again, two figures that are lying prostrate. This is also where one thinks about the use of Kuba textiles, that they were meant to be used as goods for burial rituals. So here's again where we want to think about the work as an intermediary between communities on Earth and the beyond. So rather than think about all of these objects as dependent on having to be marketable in some way. Now, in her memoirs, Faith Ringgold observes how, in her words, how she was trying to point out what happened to us in the 200 years of our country. She adds that in the year 2076, we must turn things around so that all Americans can join the celebration. So this is also where, do we want to think of this work as looking ahead to that point, to 2076? Or is it a work that suggests that 276 will somehow be a point from which to retrace a very different kind of modernism than the story that has since been written? Now, in thinking about Ringgold's works together with Tibetan tankas or African Kuba textiles, one question that these works bring to mind is, are these works double portraits? So the idea of the double portrait, it's nominally defined as a portrait that has two people and which depicts something of their relationship in a way that would induce viewers to speculate on their connection. Now, this is not coincidence because the double portrait has figured quite prominently throughout Ringgold's works. On the right is again, double portrait of intense affinity. And you notice that, again, there is a Black gentleman and a white woman. It's called Early Works, number 16, A Man Kissing His Wife from 1964. So this is 3 years before Loving v. Virginia. So 3 years before the US Supreme Court struck down state laws banning interracial marriage. So this, in some ways, do we also think of this work as a work that models a future that had yet to be fully actualized? On the left is another double portrait. It's called American People Series number 1, Between Friends from 1963. And so this was painted in a professional middle-class community. Now, what's interesting about this work is that on the back, according to the art historian Moira Ross, the original title was called The Wall Between Friends. So this is something that we kind of see right here by this red frame, that in some ways, does the frame actually divide, say, these two figures, which the title is telling us that they're friends, but is the between, is it really about connection or is it about division? Now, here is also where we want to think about different kinds of connections that Ringgold was interested in, including connections with Asian American artists. So how to create portraits of two women, and this phrase, how to create portraits of two women, this is something that Ringgold herself uses. And it was something of keen interest for her writing about the Filipino-American artist Pasita Abad. Now, in Ringgold's words, this is a kind of work that exemplified how, in her quote, creative women of color are working all over the world and are not merely minority figures within the Western world. So this is also where we want to think about Ringgold's involvement in the burgeoning, say, interest in the third world. So here on the left, you see Faith Ringgold, the artist, right here in the center was Lula Mae Blockton, Vivian Brown, and Lillian Bartok. And this was taken in 1978. So just at the moment when other interests in the third world, such as the 1976 exhibition, which took place in San Francisco, titled Other Sources, was then taking place. Now, at this panel, which Ringgold participated in, so Lowry Stokes Sims recalls Ringgold's talk as being very much interested in the transition from painting to soft sculpture and the interest in, again, having a certain kind of private space in which she could make work. Now, in both of these images I'm bringing up here was also to emphasize that the idea of the third world was not so much a place, but a position from which to track a history where geopolitical boundaries, racial boundaries could yield to moments of genuine cultural convergence. Now, as an example, we might want to think about a collaboration Ringgold Ringgold's collaboration with her assistant, Lisa Yee, 1987, called My Best Friend. Now, in Yee's words, this is a work where, quote, we created a bridge of time and place. And both works are about, again, both women who are separated by a 20-year gap or so had felt out of place growing up. And had some difficulty making friends at school. So for Ringgold, she was very interested in this depths of shared experiences, even though she and her assistant Lisa Yee were of two completely different generations. And Yee notes that you notice that the skirts are kind of hiding the text. So the text tells the story of having trouble adjusting or having some difficulty at school. And you notice that the skirts can be lifted up. So this is some kind of another image of the works. In Lisa Yee's words, we were both bad little girls telling our stories. We were not submissive. We lifted our dresses. So this is also where, again, we want to think about Ringgold as being able to being very aware of what it is that one discloses and what it is that one conceals. And here I'm reminded of the Japanese-American painter Yasuo Kuniyoshi, with whom Faith Ringgold studied with in 1950. And he knew a thing or two about socially conscious art. He would exhort his students that, quote, you don't just go out and hit the ball. You have to face the program. You have an attitude, you have a stance, and that's the only way you can hit the ball. And so is that having a stance something that underpins all of Ringgold's work? Now, in the interest of time, I'll just cycle quickly through the next sort of images. So in thinking about Ringgold's third world stance, is it an argument for a radically expanded approach to history that includes both linear movement, recursive movement, circular movement? How is it that one person is never an origin point, but in fact depends on things that come before you? Let's see. Two things I just want to draw your attention to before I close. So one is, you notice the blue right here. So this is a tanka that Ringgold did in 1972 called Feminist Series number 6. There's one of two things. Now the blue is very close to the kind of ultramarine that was introduced through British occupied India in the mid-19th century. So this is, again, something that we get a sense of Ringgold's interest in engaging with these sorts of colonial transmissions. The other thing you'll notice is the very elaborate patterned border, and that's characteristic of all of Ringgold's tankas. Now, it's important because also this is a time, so the early 70s was a time when South Asian conservators were berating their Euro-American counterparts for treating tankas as if they were the same as easel paintings. So here was the emphasis on border. Ringgold gets it. She gets it instinctively that you don't throw out borders on any account that these were religious objects. So this is also kind of an interesting way in which to think about how is it that these tankas also push back against a certain colonial archive. Now, the other thing to just point out is the inscription. So this is excerpted from a well-known quote from Harriet Tubman, published in the biography her friend Sarah Bradford published in 1886, which was titled Harriet Tubman, Moses of Her People. And in the excerpt, Tubman states, quote, "There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would take the other, for no man should take me alive. I should fight for liberty as long as my strength lasted." So that's what the one of two things refers to. It refers to the cruelty of binaries to which so many bodies were yoked, and it was used as a title. So here is also where Ringgold speaks through the title. In her own memoirs, Ringgold observes how she wasn't able to find her own voice and that she couldn't write in the way that she wanted to. Yet, I wanted very much to be heard. I was looking for alternatives. And when I came back from Europe, I found a temporary solution. I turned to these statements by famous Black women. So this is a way also in which she enables others to also have their own voices, because in order to read this, the most effective way is to sound out the words oneself. It forces you to slow down and to think about reading as something one does, not to simply extract information, but to pay obeisance, homage, to recover, to remember. So I'll close right here because I think we're out of time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kee. I'm going to invite all the panelists to turn on your cameras. And also I'd like to invite the people in attendance to feel free to submit any questions that you have through the chat. And I'd like to start by just asking Dr. Wallace, Dr. Kee, and Dr. Francis, if you would like to respond to any of what you heard from any of the other speakers tonight. Particularly perhaps Dr. Francis and Dr. Kee, you both talked about the tankas. Any new observations that you came to tonight? I have to say that I've looked at Faith Ringgold's work for a very long time, and the analyses and the descriptions and the language that you've given to talk about the work is so rich and enables us to see so much more deeply into the work. So I'd like to open it up to the panelists first.
Well, I can say that Sergeant Johnson was one of my first favorite artists, and artists that I loved and that I got, and that my mother loved him too. And it's interesting to see you make that connection between that figure in Flag is Bleeding Too and him, because I mean, that sounds really right to me. I mean, he was doing that kind of work, and he was amazing. He's somebody that we really, I know my mother admired, and then I admired very much because I could get his work really well when I was quite young.
Thank you, Michele. Can I ask you, Dr. Francis, how did you find that resonance between the two works? Did you see it, or do you know if Faith was looking at Sergeant Johnson?
I don't. I haven't interviewed Ms. Ringgold about it, but to me, it's seemingly a direct relation. That figure. I mean, what's so interesting about it as well. Even as we're talking here, that's the thing that so many people talk about in terms of what art historians talk about. What the School of Paris got from ritual African art. Many of them who were painters were actually looking at sculpture and then to learn, the sort of discoveries of three-dimensionality and plasticity and bring it into two-dimensional formats. And here's Faith Ringgold also doing the same thing in a way with this, sculpture Forever Free. But I mean, I looked at it and I'm sure I've seen, I don't know if I've actually seen that particular quote before, but I remember in the new museum actually just looking for a signal so I could text my friend, co-curator John, and say, look at this. This is something that just screams legacy. Of course, Johnson was not in New York, which is why I talk about a long black, but he was, his work was seen in the 1920s and 1930s, obviously before Miss Ringgold was born, but he's so much part of that narrative of a long Harlem Renaissance. I mean, stretch the Renaissance from, almost 1920, sometimes 1960, but, that's another discussion.
Yeah, and I'm very fascinated by Joan Kee's reading of the spirituality and the spiritual resonances of the Windows of the Wedding and the story quilts. And I think that had a lot to do with it, especially when I think about in the feminist series, there were many quotations taken from Black women abolitionists and activists. And the religious aspect of that was so important. I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a documentary now about Harriet Tubman. And there was a movie 2 years ago about Harriet Tubman. And, I think to myself, we go through these phases of who we're interested in. And right now, it seems to be Harriet Tubman. A ways back, it was Sojourner Truth. And I think, why were we not interested in Harriet? I think she was too religious and too silent and too action-oriented. And it seems like all of a sudden now everybody's interested in that, and that she sang and that she was spiritual no longer means, of course, Sojourner Truth was religious too, but that no longer is a reason to discount you as an activist or someone who's contributed to African-American history. And she was filled with that. In this documentary, they talk about it. She was filled with that spirit. That guy hit her in the head, and she had epileptic fits, and she had dreams and she had visions, all of which somehow seemed to strengthen her for her task, which was to try to free as many slaves as she could. And to her, it was a spiritual thing that she was doing. And I can understand that. She felt that way. And I think a lot of people, what do you?
Did it?
Oh no, it went back on. Anyway, I don't want to get off on Harriet Tubman, but Harriet Tubman is one of Faith's subjects. And you used the quote from the story quote that she did Joan did with Harriet Tubman. It's really a good example. I mean, a Black woman artist just looking and struggling to find models, to find a path through what all we've been told and what we haven't been told. And it was such an exciting time, especially now to see all that's coming forward now. It's almost unbelievable, that people are now celebrating Harriet Tubman, celebrating Sojourner Truth in a much more public way. My mother gave something called the Sojourner Truth Festival of the Arts in 1976 at the Women's Inter-Art Center, which is where the debut of the Wake and Resurrection of the Bicentennial Negro was. And I performed in it with my friend, Margot Jefferson, and a few other people. And now people are really interested in that work. Yeah. And it's being shown around. I was wondering how the soft sculpture would get back out there, but now it is. And we're going through troubling times.
Well, Michelle, you mentioned the word performance, and I think Jackie has a question about performance in Faith Ringgold's work. Jackie, or an observation, perhaps.
I thought it was so great that we started off with that clip of the recording for change, and thinking about performance. And then it really tied so well into Joan Kee's paper as well, because, Dr. Kee was saying, here's this artist who's sort of intervening, breaking the chain of the artwork, moving into commodity. Because that's the thing with performance art, you had to be there. So many people literally are reading sort of documentary narratives about what it's like to see it. But I just wondered if both Dr. Kee and Dr. Wallace wanted to say a little bit more about the centrality of performance and how it seems to be woven into Faith Ringgold's practice at this critical time, not only for her career, but also the American art market, or arguably a multinational art market.
Yeah. I don't know what to say. I'm still sort of sitting with the spiritual piece, the idea that there was so much isolation at that time from what Black women were doing. Ntozake Shange appeared at that conference. And, a lot of times I would think to myself, what will become of all of this? How can it be lost? How can it be, it's not going to be continued? Oh, and that's what I wanted to say. Somebody's giving a conference at the University of Chicago about the wake and resurrection about the Sojourner, it was called the Sojourner Truth Festival of the Arts. And somebody is giving a conference in Chicago to bring together all of the people who were involved in it, because it never happened again. But they're trying to bring something together that will happen again. And you don't know what these things mean when you were doing it, but Sojourner Truth was a signature name among Black feminists. And I'm watching as Harriet Tubman, who was a feminist too and a suffragette, is becoming a signature name as well. Watching as things are changing for the way people study, and the University of Chicago is going to do a conference on this, and all the people, there's quite a few people who were involved in it who are alive, and they've all been invited, and they dug it up out of archives and things. People had programs and stuff. So I would imagine that I'll be talking about the wake and resurrection of the bicentennial Negro. And the performances. The most ephemeral thing is the performances, though. It's so hard to, like, even with Change, I don't have a performance video of her performing. That was her rehearsing in her apartment.
It's a great video.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Really so interesting to see these more candid moments and the lived biography, because the lived biography is so central to the work.
Well, that's
and
what I do.
And I actually wanted to ask you all, Joan, did you want to respond to the point about performance? Did you have anything you'd like to add, performance or the intersection of performance and spirituality?
One thing, I was very struck by Dr. Wallace's use of the word isolation, because I think it really summarizes very, elegantly what it is that these works are doing. That in some ways, it was windows on the world. I don't think it's possible to see each of the tankas on their own. They have to be seen as a group. And if you don't see it as a group, it becomes an act of sacrilege. So there's something about the work that lends itself to the language of religion and ritual in a way that pushes back against the alienation that often underlines what more conventional art histories called modernism. That is it about how can we create a space in which all the pressures of competition, of maximizing self-interest, of rational behavior
Right.
that became a religion unto itself, especially by Reagan being elected in 1980. And can we see Ringgold's tankas as creating a space in which that would, those kinds of norms would not be law or not have the same kind of force? And I like how these works in some ways are embodiments of anti-isolation or counter-isolation.
That's right.
So that's,
Yeah, I really love Windows of the Wedding for that, and have been reviewing it more because its titles, it was a series that she did to partly promote the idea of marriage for my sister and I. And as I've gotten older, I can see that in the titles, I don't know, maybe one of the titles is Don't Talk Too Much. There's a list of advice for people who are going to be in a couple. And each piece has one of those titles. It's so bold. But what you'll hear her say if you read her memoir is, there wasn't any point in me trying to please anybody but myself because nobody was looking anyway. I might as well do what I wanted and what I needed to do. And that's what she needed to do. And it's just an amazing thing. I think that exists somewhere for every artist.
Yeah.
But to have someone come from that far outside to say that and to still hold out to get in is, I think, kind of impressive.
So I have a rather large question for all of you that has to do with the language that we have or we don't have to describe Faith Ringgold's overall body of work. Because very often when people write about her work or they speak about it, they'll talk about a particular aspect of it or a particular body of work, and they'll get very deep into that body of work. But one of the things that permeates her art making throughout her career, throughout her life, has been her drawing from many different traditions, many different artistic traditions and aesthetic traditions, cultural traditions, but not necessarily in terms of appropriating other cultures, and not in the traditional idea of being influenced by other, art and artifacts from history. So she's not appropriating cultures. She's not really responding in terms of influence in the conventional way that we think of it in art history. She's combining different artistic traditions with biography. How would you describe her overall approach to art making, her overall approach to being an artist?
Well, I don't know how to describe that because I'm not an artist. But I will tell you this about that Café des Artistes. All of those people, pretty much everybody who's in that picture is someone who I think actively was an influence on Faith's work at some point. And I thought that Sergeant Johnson was in that picture.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Right. Yeah, this would be her list of people that she went to. I mean, including Maurice Utrillo and who else is back there? Well, Van Gogh is a particular favorite, and the others. These are people who do art that she incorporated or borrowed in some way or was influenced. William Johnson was really very key, and Jacob Lawrence, and these people were people that, and also all the women, but in different ways. It's a little bit coded, I guess. Actually, encrypted, if that's. I mean, I'm not an art historian, so I don't know about how you talk about influence, but there was an influence, and she wanted to recognize and acknowledge that, to lose the thread. You know, this is her canon.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they're fighting in the story, they're fighting over, you know, you men have to realize you have to let us women and speak and you know, have our say, and the men are a little bit disturbed about that.
So in a sense, she's writing art history from her own point of view.
Oh yeah, 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 she is. I guess she felt it was about time, because that was back, well, that was after change. She was, it started 1990, so she was 60. There's a sense in which in 1960, it seems to me, my mother started her career over again. But the French collection, the American collection. After all she'd done, she wasn't getting the attention that she wanted, or the recognition for the work that is so recognized now. She started over again and retold the story with William Marie and her daughter Marlena. Which, I mean, you know, there's nothing more powerful than being able to do that when you're not getting the encouragement that you would like to get.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always been people who liked her. She's always had her coterie and her fans. But, you know, as we know, the art world is made up of a series of steps and ladders, and people being excluded and, I don't know, monetized, and so much of it is about money.
Joan or Dr. Kee or Dr. Francis, would you like to, and you don't feel compelled to, but to respond to the question that I posed about, you know, how one applies language to try to characterize Faith Ringgold's approach to art making, which draws on so many different cultural influences, but in her own particular way, you know, and in a way, as I said, that doesn't involve cultural appropriation, or at least doesn't appear to, and isn't necessarily a traditional approach to influence in terms of extending an existing tradition. She's drawing on art history, but in her own very particular way. No?
I'm happy. Jackie, if you wanted to go first, I'm fine.
Where's your sound? You're not making any noise.
No, I wanted Joan to start. I know you.
Oh, you want Joan to start? Okay.
Yeah. So two things that strike me. So one is, you know, especially with the Tatankas, that, you know, she allows the Tatanka format to not necessarily devour her, but she lets it embody her work in a way that, again, one, she instinctively understands that the most important thing about the Tatanka is not necessarily the painting, it's the border. And at a time when all these white Euro-American conservators were trying to cut out the border and just conserve sort of the inner part.
Wow.
So one is that there's a kind of this almost sort of intuitive understanding of how other cultures operate, the operation that's inherent in these other cultures. So it can't be called cultural appropriation because we don't have, she's not someone that says, okay, I'm going to pick this, and pick this, and make something and exclude other people from contributing to this. The other aspect that strikes me is that, is she also trying to endorse a commons-based model of art history? So quilts, for example, are traditionally done in a collective. The Kuba textiles were traditionally done with women just passing off, you know, one section onto someone else. That all of those artists that are gathered in each of those quilts, you know, for me, it seems that this is also her way of signaling a certain kind of indebtedness, but it's an indebtedness that's born out of how do we cultivate an attitude of, how do we think about gratitude as a virtue that is necessary for being a modern artist? So, you know, there's also a sense of morality that comes through in her works that, you know, doesn't, you know, it seems completely out of joint with say, secular capitalist culture that incentivizes the sole author and production for gain. And these are not works that adhere to that model. That these are works that say, the windows on the world, for example, in some ways they only are truly actualized when there is a gathering, many people looking at them together, and it's that togetherness that perhaps underwrites maybe all of because the works are all very different, all of say Ringgold's works, but that interest in togetherness, how can we be together, and how can we stay together despite pressures not to, or pressures to do one's own thing. So that's
Thank you so much. Dr. Francis, did you like to add anything?
I love the specificity of what Dr. Kee just said. I mean, speaking, more generally, I would just say, the embrace of craft. I mean, everybody talks about craft being rediscovered probably about 10, 15 years ago, but think about Ringgold and her contemporaries, Miriam Shapiro's and others, who are literally in this moment saying, this is work of art. This is artwork, this is creative practice, and making a strong case for it. I also think in terms of, her kind of performance pieces. I mean, there's a kind of moment, I think maybe, or an arc of time from the 60s moving into the 70s where people are doing kind of spoken word poetry, which is very autobiographical, et cetera. And I think about her performances because when she starts talking in that way in the 80s and 90s, there's a kind of backlash that, had started already, like, oh, we don't want to hear any more of your stories. We know all of them already. And what her performance is doing, whether it's the actual performance or even in the text and image works, in the quilt, is saying, you're not going to shut me up. I'm going to
No, you can't shut me up.
So I think that's also a kind of, important intervention in terms of her work, which again, definitely spans the breadth of practices in terms of, somebody who's gone through Cubism as every 20th century artist has, somebody who's not seen in terms of her painting as a pop art. I don't understand how any pop art survey can come out and not mention her flag works as part of it. Deliberate to use those works. It's outrageous.
I think we're living this change, possibly.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting a sign from our host that we need to bring this to a close, but I just want to say that more than being added to art history or finally recognized and incorporated into the canon, which we all know has been so long in coming for Faith Ringgold, I think that the deeper we look at her work and the more we explore it, the more we see that she's actually rewriting aspects of that art history. That she is creating we're discovering her paradigms of art making that don't just fit into the existing narrative, but that actually are transforming it. And I'd like to just leave us with a feeling of togetherness. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I'd like to thank Dr. Kee, Dr. Francis, and of course, Dr. Wallace, and our hosts here at the museum. Everyone, it's always kind of abrupt when these Zoom meetings turn off and suddenly we pop off the screen. So let's just sort of maybe have a quiet moment, and then they'll turn the cameras off, and thank everyone. Thank you all for coming. Good night.
Thank you.